Hey guys, hope you're well. It's Alessio and welcome to a scary and Halloween edition of our videos. In this video, we're going to ask an important question which many of you have been asking me, which is it likely that Bitcoin will fill its scary gap that it formed here, this gap that formed recently after it jumped up here. All right, so that's what we're talking about here, this gap. So we'll talk about this in a few minutes. Before I do that though, I just want to say I want to wish you a fantastic Halloween this evening. Whatever you do, I hope it's spooky and scary. And let me just tell you also that I've also prepared our own little pumpkins, as you can see here. Just pushed some holes through this pumpkin, as you can see here. It looks pretty good, actually, if I may say so myself. All right, guys, let's get back to the charts. So, as you can see here, one of the reasons I want to make this video is because a lot of questions I've received recently has been about this important point, which is that is Bitcoin likely to fill the gap, all right? This gap that it formed here as it jumped up. Now, before I begin, let me first of all say that I don't really care if Bitcoin fills that gap or not. I'll give you two reasons why I don't care. Number one, firstly, because for me, what is more important is a technical picture. What does that mean? Well, as I explained to you in my previous video about a potential bottoming pattern on Bitcoin, I said to you, look, Bitcoin is held at 200 moving average. That's the main thing. That's the most important thing. It's also gone above the 50 simple moving average, the white line you see here. And it's also broken the trend line, this red line you see. It's broken above that and it's holding that trend line very beautifully. So far, for me, what is more important is the technical patterns, what is happening on the technical picture. So whether Bitcoin goes and fills that gap or not, honestly, who cares? For me, it doesn't matter one bit. Also, we just go on a lower time frame chart. This is a 4-hour time frame chart. If you just take a look at this, you'll see that pretty much is filled the majority of this gap. So as you can see here, after the jump up causing this gap here, notice that pretty much most of this gap has already been filled, right? So if we just measure it from here to here, for example, you'll see that most of this gap has been filled. How much of the gap is left? Well, not much. I mean, that's about it. Does this really matter? Honestly, I don't think so. Maybe some of you might disagree with me. That's fine. That's fine. We can disagree. But for me, honestly, I don't really care whether it fills that gap or not. But here's something I am going to do for you in this video. Just to give you more information about it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at some of the previous gaps that have formed and show you what Bitcoin usually has done. For example, during the early massive rally that we saw in the summer of this year, notice what Bitcoin did here. Let me just go back here a little bit. What I've noticed is a very interesting pattern that I want to show you. The pattern seems to be this. There was a gap here. You can see there was a gap. By the way, I'm using a chart that is standard. I'm not using a log chart because I don't really like log charts. I'm not a fan of log charts personally. But as you will see here, there was a gap here. And yes, this gap was filled very soon after, as you can see here by this bar. There were a few other gaps that have formed here. You can see, notice a couple of gaps that formed here and here. What's interesting about these two gaps is that Bitcoin did not fill them until several weeks afterwards. So you'll see that when these gaps formed on Bitcoin during this massive rally that occurred during its wave 5, as you can see here, these gaps did not really fill. I mean, this gap over here, for example, did not fill until weeks, potentially a few months afterwards, okay? As you can see here. That gap you see here was filled, yeah, I mean, several months afterwards by this bar you see there. And let me just go back a little bit more so show you a few more examples of this. So, by the way, I'm only looking at up gaps, not down gaps, because that's the one we're interested in here, up gaps. So, as you'll see here, okay, here's a few interesting ones. This was back in November and December of 2017 during a massive rally that went up to 20,000. Notice we had a gap right here, as you can see, and this gap, interestingly, let me just get a pen and just draw it here for you. This gap did not fill until, I mean, at least a few months afterwards, right? After the major drop that occurred in January. So what we can glean from previous examples is that when gaps usually form in major rallies or bounces, they don't always fill automatically. Sometimes it takes a few weeks, sometimes a few months. Now this gap that occurred here, that filled almost automatically, very quickly as a matter of fact. Let me just show you some more examples of this. And it does get more interesting here. So what is interesting, okay, here's one for you. Now you'll see here we have two gaps, one here and one here. So this gap over here filled very soon afterwards, but this one only partially. So this gap was only partially filled before the major rally higher. So sometimes gaps don't always fill all the way through, as you see here. And by the way, notice this gap over here did not fill until at least a few weeks afterwards. Let's go back a bit more. Okay, again, another example for you of another gap right there, which did not fill until at least a few weeks after. Here's an interesting example I want to show you. Let me go back a bit. And yeah, so this one, I think this is from the year 2016. And what is interesting about this particular gap here, take a look right there. This was when the price of Bitcoin was at the 600s, 630. This gap has not been filled at all. And the same, I think, goes for this gap over here. Okay, so this is back in the year 2016. And correct me if I'm wrong, but these two gaps were never filled. I don't recall Bitcoin ever coming back and filling these gaps. So sometimes I guess gaps just don't fill. And let me just go back a bit. Let me just zoom out. Yeah. I mean, those gaps were not filled. Now, maybe they may get filled eventually. Who knows, in a few years' time. But the bottom line is, you know, it is what it is.
What it is, man.
So let me show you a few more examples. This is interesting. We have a couple of examples of gaps that were filled eventually. Here's a gap in 2016 again. Yeah, and another gap here. Now, as you can see, this gap over here was filled a few weeks afterwards, but this gap over here was only filled, I think it was filled, yeah, after about a few weeks or a few months afterwards. So the common pattern seems to be that gaps don't always have to fill immediately. Sometimes, as we can see here, sometimes price of Bitcoin can form a gap, continue to go up, and then come back a few weeks afterwards and then fill it. So there can be a delay sometimes of a few weeks, maybe a few months. All right, so as you can see here for yourself, these two gaps here, they were not filled until at least a few weeks or months afterwards by these two major bars that dropped here. Now this gap over here, that's interesting. There's another gap right there, all right, after a gap up. And I don't think that gap actually has been filled either, all right? So that gap was formed in February 2016. And as far as I can tell, that gap has not yet been filled. So very interesting pattern indeed. So let's go back to the chart of Bitcoin right now, as we can see here. So as I said before, guys, fact is, for me, I don't really care if Bitcoin fills this gap or not, for the two reasons I just mentioned. For me, what matters is the technicals, the technical picture on the chart. The technical picture is, to me, far more important, as I explained to you in the previous video. So go ahead and watch that previous video. And also because Bitcoin has, for all intents and purposes, filled the majority of this gap. All right, it's only left a little bit, tiny morsel of gap left behind. Now, if that gap is so important that's going to get filled, as we've seen historically and statistically, again, historical patterns seem to show to us that if that gap is going to get filled eventually, it may not happen at least for another few weeks, or maybe a few months. All right, so we'll have to see on that. For the moment, though, if Bitcoin has bottomed, which seems likely, then we're likely to see perhaps a major continuation of this rally. We might see a further continuation of a bounce further higher in the coming weeks and months, before potentially, maybe, and again, it's a wild guess, that maybe in the next few months, maybe the next few weeks, it may come back and perhaps fill this gap, if at all. And that's by no means guaranteed. We have absolutely no way of knowing if that's going to happen. All right, guys, for the moment, though, the probabilities and the odds have turned towards the bulls. All right. Again, as I mentioned before in the previous video, as long as Bitcoin holds this low, as long as Bitcoin holds above this low that it maintained here, this is a key support level, then the probabilities are showing that likely Bitcoin has formed the bottom. I'll leave you with some spooky and random images of my trips to England, the US, and also Iran. Hope this video helps, and I wish you a very spooky Halloween.